Chapter one is about the human body and it's an orientation to it. So, in this chapter, we'll be talking about the study of anatomy and physiology. You'll be learning the names of the organ systems, a little bit about homeostasis, and anatomical terminology that you'll be using. So, the first question is, what is anatomy? The word anatomy simply refers to the structure. So it's the structure of body parts and their relationship to one another. Whereas physiology is referring to the word function. So the function of body parts and how they can carry out life sustaining activities. There's going to be some subcategories of each that you should be aware of. For anatomy, we can either look at something with the naked eye, and that would be gross anatomy. When we refer to gross anatomy, think of something like anatomy lab that maybe a medical student would take in that first year. You can view the body in different areas of the body. You can view the leg region, view it by system or the surface. And that's macroscopic anatomy, what we can see with the naked eye. What we can't see with the naked eye is going to require a microscope. And there's various types of microscopic anatomy, several of which you'll be learning about in this first unit. For example, cytology is the study of cells, and that's what we'll be covering in chapter 3. Histology is the study of tissues, and we'll be covering that in chapter 4. We won't be covering embryology, but it's the development of an embryo during different days of development. You'll learn a little bit about this next semester in A&P2. Developmental anatomy would be even more extensive. It's the anatomical development all through the life of the person. So going from a single cell organism to an embryo to a fetus to a person. So the physiology then is the basically how these activities are carried out. So it's the why. And they're based on the different organ systems, so you'll need to know those. So, for example, renal physiology is the study of the urinary system and specifically how the kidney functions. Cardiovascular physiology is the study of the circulatory system involving mainly the heart and blood vessels and how they function. And it usually focuses on a very cellular or molecular level. And there's some basic principles, physical principles that go along with physiology. Things like electrical currents, pressure, and movement. So an example of how the anatomy and the physiology complement themselves is shown on this slide, and it's what we call the principle of complementarity of structure and function. So in this case, the sharp edges of the incisors, that's the structure. So basically you see whatever you can see is the anatomy, and the why is the physiology. In this case, it allows for cutting like scissors. We have another example here. We have the flat surfaces of the molars. Again, you could kind of think of that as the what, like what you see, and the why is the function. So the function in this case is to act like a mortar and pestle to be able to grind the food up into smaller pieces. When we talk about A&P, we need to know the levels of structural organization in order and what is contained within each level. So the human body is so complex. The first level, the chemical level, would include atoms, molecules, and organelles. And the most important atoms that you'll learn more about in chapter 2 are carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And they're important because they make up 96% of the human body. Those atoms are going to combine with one another to make molecules like carbon dioxide, or water, or even larger molecules like DNA or RNA. And then some of the chemical reactions that occur within organelles are contained here, but notice they're also in that chemical level, which is that first level. The second level is the cellular level. The third level is the tissue level. The fourth level is the organ level. Fifth is organ system. And sixth is organismal level. So in this case, the organelle shown is the mitochondria. It's responsible for making ATP. And you'll be learning a lot about different organelles when we get to chapter 3. Within the cellular level, it is a single cell. In this case, we have a smooth muscle cell, but there are trillions of other cells within the body also. The tissue level is groups of similar functions. And again, tissue is histology. And the example here would be smooth muscle tissue. But there's other examples like epithelial tissue, nervous tissue, connective tissue, which you'll be learning about in chapter 4. Then the organ level contains 2 or more types of tissues. It's usually about 3 organs, but it doesn't have to be, I'm sorry, it's usually 3 types of tissues, but it doesn't have to be. An example of the organ level that we see here is a blood vessel. And I bet a lot of you before this lecture didn't necessarily think of a blood vessel as an organ. By definition, it is, though. So again, if it's 2 or more tissues, in this case, there's epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue is the lining of a lot of different parts of the body, like the lining of the respiratory system is epithelium. In this case, the lining of blood vessels is epithelium. Underneath epithelium is almost always going to be connective tissue. And there's lots of different types of connective tissue that you'll be learning about in chapter 4. And then we have muscle tissue. And you'll learn later in the semester that there are 3 types of muscle tissue. And there's really a 4th type of tissue here as well, which would be nervous tissue. And there's going to be nerves that are going to be affecting this blood vessel that cause it either to constrict or dilate. So the 4 types of tissues that you should know are epithelium. It's going to be the lining of things like blood vessels, the respiratory tract, the digestive tract. It's also going to be the skin. Underneath the epithelium is connective tissue. Then there's muscle. And finally, nervous tissue. So the next level is the organ system level, and these are organs that work closely together for a simple function. So the example that they show in this diagram here is the cardiovascular system, which has the heart and the blood vessels. So one of the things that you'll need to master for this chapter is knowing the various organ systems, the main components, and their general function. That's all you need to know about them at this point. In later chapters, you'll have entire chapters on that system. And finally, at the organismal level, it's obviously the most complex, and it's all organ systems that are working together to make the whole organism.